So those of you who've joined us before, welcome back. If it's your first time, you're really welcome to be with us as well. If you're joining us on YouTube, hey, I hope you're going to enjoy the next sort of 45 minutes to an hour or so. This is a second in a series of webinars that we're doing on the book of Ruth. And what we're going to try and do over the course of Bible Month is look at the text from a number of different angles and shine a few different lenses on it and see the ways in which those lenses highlight aspects of the text that we might not otherwise have seen. So last week, I tried to lead us in a bit of a play reading of the text. And partly that was about helping us recognize that we receive this as a story. And actually receiving stories that invite us to engage with the narrative in a certain way. It reminds us that we have a cast of characters who have their own experiences, their own emotions throughout the text that we may need to backfill because we're not given them explicitly. We are reminded that there is a narrator who is trying to lead us to perceive events in a certain way, which is not necessarily the only way to perceive events, but it is one of the ways that we are being invited to perceive things. And it also one of the aspects of the narrative, I suppose, we wanted to highlight last week is the fact that God is a silent character in this book. Interestingly, there are things that are attributed to God as God's activity, but God himself appears to not have kind of explicit agency, which I think has interesting pastoral and theological implications for us, that there is a whole book here of the Bible where the activity and the thinking and the purposes of God appear to be veiled from view. So we had some discussions around that. This week, I'm very pleased that Jane is going to lead us in a very particular reading of the text. So she's going to open up a more feminist or womanist view of the events. So this lens will be very different to the one that we looked at last week. And Jane and I have had a number of back and forths over the kind of build up as she's been kind of presenting this particular perspective. And I've been going, but it's not what I think the narrator thinks. And actually the important thing is, it doesn't matter if it's not what the narrator thinks, because it is a way that we receive the text. It is a lens that we can bring to the text, and scripture invites us to engage with things both on our own terms, but also on other people's terms. And actually we are better Christians, we're better readers of the Bible when we open ourselves up to other perspectives of the text and hear what other people have to say about it. So I'm very excited to have Jane kind of give voice to her particular reading. So I'm going to hand over to Jane in a second, but before I do, it would be good for us to just begin our time together in prayer, if that's all right. So I'll just invite a moment of silence, and then I'm going to read a prayer and then hand over to Jane. Thank you, God, that through the ages, your people have tried to get to know you better through studying the Bible. Help us today to look again at what we can learn about you. Help us to see the interesting, the quirky, the revolutionary, the new perspective. Help us to find the assurance of your unfailing love for humanity. Help us to search for a deeper truth than the one we have known for what feels like forever. Help us to dare to ask the difficult or complex question as we seek to understand your will for us. Help us to stay sure of your grace as we grapple with the unexplained. Help us to see better, the love revealed, the way of life encouraged, and the transforming good news contained within the pages of this book. Amen. Jane, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess many of you have been going to church for a very, very long time, for over 50 years. And I think I thought I knew what Ruth was about and what the story of Ruth and the book of Ruth had to show me. And when we knew Bible Month was going to be about Ruth this year, I thought, well, I perhaps best read it again, and make sure that between us, the team are fully appraised of what Ruth's about and how we're going to divide up responsibility for our thinking about Ruth. And all of a sudden, pretty quickly, within a few sentences, I got to the situation where I thought, actually, I don't really know if Ruth is about what I thought it was about at all. I felt like I was seeing it afresh for the first time. I don't know if that was because I'm a 56-year-old woman and, you know, I maybe have remembered reading it last when I was 36 or 26 or whatever was going on. But certainly I found more and more when I was reading the book of Ruth, actually I was quite grumpy. I was quite cross. And as a woman, I was really, really cross. And so I had to try and work through what all this was about. And I know Michael has alluded to it already, but we've had a lot of conversations in our team about what we think the story of Ruth is about and what we do with it from different perspectives. And robust discussion, I think, is probably the best way of describing our early encounters on the book. My colleague and who works in the Northwest, Jasmine Devadison, and she's also a contributor to the Bible Month book this year, writes this, and she says this: feminist hermeneutics, you know, that's the way we interpret the biblical text. It's a big word, but that's basically what it means. Feminist hermeneutics rejects the idea that there's only one mega story and recognizes that diverse meta-narratives exist inside what is traditionally seen as the story. You can find that in the Bible Month magazine if you really want to go back and look at it. In other words, the way we interpret the biblical text from a feminist perspective just rejects the idea that there's only one story to tell, but in fact notices that there are a lot of tiny stories within layers, within corners that are worth looking at as part of what we do. So with that in mind, and a little bit of background thinking about how many of you, I don't know if you've dipped into worship, leading and preaching, either because you're a mentor or a tutor, or any of those kind of activities, but you'll know that by the time you get to module 8, we're talking about all kinds of theology. We're talking about liberation theology, Black theology, disability theology. We're talking about feminist theology, and within that, womanist theology. In other words, the way that women are looking at the biblical text, but from their own cultural perspective. You know, from a Black perspective, from a people of colour's perspective, as well as a white perspective. So really, really being careful for people to look at the biblical text from their own perspective in all sorts of ways. So, you know, so that thread of how we look at theology is really present in our current teaching for student preachers. So with all of that going on in the background, all of that information from Jasmine and the book and what we know within our study material, I set about doing some research on the book of Ruth. Research from feminist writers, research from writers from a Christian and a Jewish perspective, because a lot of Jewish writers particularly go back to the book of Ruth still and analyse it. And it's clear from their perspective that this is a book about women and how they interact with men. This is a book about oppression. This is a book about sex. This is a book about sexual politics. This is a book about names and the use of names and how people are considered. This is a book about the other, the person from outside the context. What's also certain is they cannot agree on anything at all. Even their feminist perspectives are arguing with one another. Some people say, Ruth, no, she's no kind of feminist at all. She's just complicit. Her striving for perfection, her compliance, her willingness to be a pawn in Naomi's game. What kind of a woman is she in this story? They're annoyed feminists. There are some others who say, Ruth, she's great. She's faithful. She's willing to take the risk. She does dangerous acts. She protects Naomi. You know, she's really faithful. This act of devotion more to the women in her life than trying to find herself a new husband must be applauded. This is the way to step up and be who you really are as a woman. There's also Ruth challenging from the inside, recognizing that she's operating within a culture that is not in her favor and doing everything she can to make the best of it. given the consequences. And I suppose I could go on, to be honest. So even those people looking at Ruth from a feminist lens are looking at it with all sorts of different things coming to the fore for them. So hopefully, we're not going to get through all of that today, but hopefully we recognise that as we read this text together, looking at it from this particular viewpoint, whether we're men or women, whether we're people of colour or people who are white, whether people who know and have constantly lived and consistently lived in the same context, or whether we're people who've had to travel about into different contexts and find ourselves in new places and know what that feels like, whatever we're bringing to the table, God will reveal to us through his Spirit something that it's worth noticing. And so that's the basis that I want us to move forward with our feminist reading of Ruth today. So first of all, I've got a question for you. We're going to split into small groups, no more than 4 people, and you're going to have about 10 minutes together. And this is the question, and I'll try and pop it in the chat room once I've set you off so you can be reminded of it as you go. What are we spotting in this story of Ruth that we find difficult or unpalatable as far as women are concerned? What is it that we're noticing, that we're not liking, that we don't want to see? Or, and dependent on how you're getting on, what are we wondering about as far as the women in this story are concerned, and particularly Ruth? So what's bothering us, but also what is making us ask the question, why did they say that? Why are they doing that? They're the questions I want you to think about in the small group. I'm going to give you a starter answer. I've got a list of about 10 that I think you might say, but I'm quite happy to have the other 20 or 30 that you might come up with. In this story, women are quite often not referred to by their name when they're being spoken to. And in fact, nobody says to Ruth, Ruth, you need to do this. They call her my daughter. They call her the immigrant woman. They call other women within the story the women. So there's something really noticing there about how we refer to women, or how the women are referred to in discussion within this story, that says, that's a bit weird to me. If you spoke to me, I'd expect you to say, hey, Jane, so-and-so. Why is nobody doing that to Ruth? So that's the kind of thing I'm noticing. I wonder what you're noticing that bothers you, that worries you, or that makes you ask questions about women. So I'm going to ask Michael now to set us off in our small group thinking. There'll only be 3 or 4 of you. Make sure you say hello to each other and you take notice of what each other's saying. When we come back to, we're going to take a plenary in the chat space. So please do have a couple of points of note that you want to share. Thanks, Michael. It would be really interesting to begin to see the kind of things you're noticing. We're going to have some conversation around it. But if you've noticed anything in particular that you'd like to share with everybody else, if you can pop it into the chat function. We've discovered that you can save whatever anybody puts into the chat function, and we'll be able to send a list of the things that are put in there out with our follow-up stuff. So we'll be able to see all the things that people have noticed in their conversation spaces. So I'll give you a moment to start off that conversation. What's happened in your small groups? What have you noticed? What are you bothered about the women in this story? And what are you wondering about? So feel free to type away. I'll give you a couple of minutes, and then we'll take some plenary conversation. Is everybody sure how to do that, to find their way into the chat function at the bottom of the screen there and type away? You might have nominated somebody from your group to do it, so that's good. Okay. So we've got some wondering going on about who the writer of the book was. and she was obviously considered to be property. She's asked to whom does this woman belong, but obviously she didn't really appear to belong to anybody, which is interesting. Definitely something about commodity. And there's a lot of people being bothered about the fact that if she'd have been left on her own, that the men would have automatically abused her, she'd have been open to abuse. Gosh, there's lots of really rich thinking going on here. Yes, Boaz buys a field and a wife in the process. That's an interesting observation. And where the childlessness of Ruth comes, also really fascinating. Really rich pickings going on there in our chat space. We're going to keep our eye. I'm going to get Michael to keep his eye on the electronic hand raising, because I know people can do that through participants. And he can keep his eye on that. But if anybody wants to wave their real hand at me for the start of it, if they've something to say and to share, and we'll take it from there. Don't be shy now.
Kim has her hand up.
Okay, Kim, in that case then, let's hear what you have to say, please, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, like Joe put on the chat function about who the author of Ruth was, and does it make a difference either way? And I've got a feminist companion to the book of Ruth, and one of their articles is the fact that Ruth most likely was a woman this is a woman telling a woman's story. And that really sort of opened my eyes and made me think about, well, then what does it mean about the systems? What if it, why is she still writing within that system, and what is that to tell us about? Rather than just thinking, oh, here's a man telling a woman's story from a man's point of view and getting quite angry with it. Actually, this is written in a style, if it is a woman, for a particular reason, and why is that? And what does that still tell us?
Yeah, and I think that's really fascinating, because in the stuff that I read, there's a real kind of balancing argument around where that writing comes from and who might have written it. And it's not typical for women to have written things in the Old Testament, so that's quite a leap of an assumption to be making in that space, really. But definitely the authorship of any book really does colour what we read from it and interpret from it. What else have we been thinking about? What about this business then of Orpah or Naomi being, Orpah being manipulative? What about this stuff around Orpah's decision to return back from where she came? Obviously that's come out in a couple of conversations. Which group had that conversation, and what have you got to say around that? Derek, I think this comment from you, so you might have to speak up on behalf of the people in your group.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it was only the sense in which superficial reading of this, it always feels as if Orpah had made the easy decision and Ruth had made the brave decision. Right. But if we take seriously the way in which they were probably soiled goods in their own community because they'd married foreigners, there is a sense in which Orpah's decision to return may actually have been quite a brave decision. And depending on what Ruth's family view of her was, whether her decision to return might have been more dangerous than going with Naomi.
Okay. Yes, and actually the complexity of the background for both of those women, that in a lot of the research that I did, it was really apparent that some people considered that both Ruth and Orpah may have been forced into marriage into Naomi's sons in the first place. That actually, as Moabite women, their lives wasn't easy even right up until that point. So although they were married into Naomi's family, it wasn't necessarily a pleasant journey to get there. So there's all sorts of backstory connotations about who people belong to. And of course, as Moabites, they were an ostracized group of women in the first place. They were an ostracized community in the first place. So all of that adds to layers. So nobody really knows which was the easy decision and which was the tough one. And that, I think all the women in this story were caught between quite a rock and a hard place, to be honest, for different reasons at different times.
Pat has unmuted herself. I wasn't sure if that was...
No, so I was just trying to think about living in a different culture. There's 10 houses on my street, and I am the ethnic minority. Most of the people on my street are from different countries, and it's very interesting to start to listen and accept, basically, accept other people's ways of doing things, which I think is my attitude, but possibly in other people, that there are prejudices that my neighbours have had to meet. Even now, prejudices exist. So they must have existed in those times as well.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And prejudices because of race, because of culture, because of just because of being women. Actually, it was. You know, it's such a multi-layered story around bias, and whether that bias is conscious towards people, as we see quite often, women as belongings. What are they doing here? Women, you know, referred to as the immigrant woman rather than, oh, she's Ruth. You know, that kind of layer of stuff, but also the unconscious bias around people, and even women. You know, the women in the circles talking about the other women. It's never really very friendly. It's never really very, very caring. There's a lot of assumption, and there's a lot of backstory within it. So yeah, I agree with you. There's all sorts of levels for stuff for us to notice. Very much in this story, women are seen as routes to wealth. They're seen as routes to land. I noticed a question in the chat room saying, you know, was the land theirs before they married or after they're married? There's stuff around women having to be submissive to get what they want or need. Actually, a lot of this story, when you read it carefully, is about how they get food to stay alive, and actually the lengths that the women have to go to make sure that they can put food on the table, from gleaning in fields, from laying at the feet of a man who's laying near the grain store. Lots of things around food and access to food. And women's value seems to be only related to their childbearing capability. And as somebody pointed out in the chat room, you know, Ruth's been non-childbearing for 10 years, and then all of a sudden now she bears a child. And I suppose the last thing I have to say about this, and around my nervousness around this, is that when that child was born, the child was given to Naomi, and Naomi named that child. It was never really considered to be Ruth's child. And it's not until we get to the genealogy in the beginning of Matthew that we see Ruth named within that genealogy as being the mother of that child, because it's important within the greater narrative of the Christian story and the Jewish story. So lots to notice, lots to wonder about, lots to consider, that it's not just an easy place to sit. Women very definitely in this story are seen to having to please men to get what they need. They have to be submissive, they have to be obedient, they have to put on their best clothes and tart themselves up with perfume and have a bath in order to get what they need. And I find that quite difficult. Says, oh, you've got your hand up, so let's take the last word from you, and then we'll move on to some more questions for the small groups.
No, please don't. But I just wanted to say that it wasn't. It was the women who named the child. That's what was interesting. Okay, that neither Naomi, nor Boaz, or Ruth named this child. It was the women, and the neighbors. I mean, when you have
Yeah.
lots of neighbors with you, you're not going to mention each one of them in a story, are you? You will say my neighbors. So I think that's putting, thoughts where they don't exist at all. This is my hobby horse since last time we met, actually, that we are putting our thoughts and our way of reasoning into the book that doesn't reflect that at all. I think.
Yes. And I think it's back to this conversation that both Michael and I alluded to right at the beginning of this, that actually, with a faithfulness to the text, we're looking at the narrative in a certain way. The narrator wants us, the writer of the story wants us to see it a certain way. But also when we look at the text, we're seeing things and noticing things that just feel really odd to us. And actually it is worth paying attention to them, even if we come to the point where we explore them, like you and I have just done, and come to a different conclusion about them. Actually, they're still very present in the story for us. I'm going to move us on to ask you another question. This is another question for small groups. I'm not sure if you'll end up in the same ones or if Michael might just randomly mix you up and you end up with some new conversation partners, which might be nice. So I want you to look at the story again, but this time I'd like you to look for instances of solidarity and protection within the story relating to the women. So that can be from the men to the women, from women to women, from culture, whatever you like, really. Where are the instances of solidarity and protection within the story to be found? We've already had a bit of a clue, haven't we, in our wondering from our first chat room. I wonder what would have happened to Ruth if Boaz hadn't said, leave her alone. So that's your next question. Where are the instances of solidarity and protection within the story relating to the women? And we'll see you in about 5 minutes, only about 5 minutes for this one. So again, feel free if you've something that you've noticed about where the examples are of solidarity and protection within the
story. Long. We weren't watching the time.
Ah, did it feel really short, Joe, this time, did it?
It did, yes.
Oh, well, that means you've had some really good chats. So these instances then of solidarity and protection within the story, type away in the chat for us so we've got a record of them. But at the same time, if you'd love to raise your hand for me or raise your electronic hand between us, we'll try and take some feedback. Oh, no instances of solidarity in the story of Ruth. no instances of protection. I don't believe it for a moment. Okay, so both daughter-in-laws were willing initially to stay with Naomi. They were definitely, that's an interesting comment, isn't it? There was definitely some sign that actually they were trying their hardest to work out what to do in the given time.
Caesar has his hand up again, by the way.
Oh, Caesar, speak away to us.
Caesar, by the way.
Caesar.
Yes, in our group we said that, if I'm correct in saying this, that there was solidarity all the way around in the story because Naomi and Ruth worked well together and so on and so forth as they went back to Naomi's land and so on, and also Boaz sort of behaved well in the sense that he protected Ruth from the other men from another field and so on and so forth, and also the workers in Boaz's field didn't reject Ruth at all. And we said, well, it was a small community, so everybody knew each other, and they would have known that she was a foreigner, but she came with Naomi, and so on and so forth. And so there was some show of solidarity all the way around.
Yeah, and it certainly feels, doesn't it, in places like the women are sticking by each other and the women are being protected by the men, even if it wasn't expected culturally at that time. You know, the men were stepping out of their usual comfort zone to do that. If I was having my provocative stroppy head on, I might say, well, it might have been really nice if the food had been provided from the outset, rather than it being gleanings, rather than it being eventually an invitation to eat together with other people, you know, from the outset. But, you know, maybe I'm just being extra stroppy on this Monday afternoon in June. But I think you're right. I think there is very definite solidarity, and particularly from Boaz trying to step up into that space, and in the process of around the land, actually, that he used the process well to try and make sure that it was above board for everybody within the context, but at the same time was protective to Naomi as owner of the land, because obviously women and their land were not well protected in any given, you know, in that given time. What else am I seeing here? Dynamics that Naomi was treated as grandma, even though no blood relationship. So that's interesting, isn't it? That somehow, you know, she was incorporated into that space and given some kind of friendly protection around that. Anything else that anybody wants to say aloud to us?
Kim's hand is up again.
Aha, Kim, speak to us.
Oh, no, that's rather bold. No, I wondered in our group about, we don't really know much about the Moabite traditions around obligations to family widows, because obviously it's the girl's choice, it's Ruth and Orpah's choice to stay with Naomi in what was Naomi's strange land.
Yeah.
We don't know what the duties around to them should have been in regards to their cultural expectations, because like you say, Naomi was now the mother-in-law, and we were sort of saying it takes a very strong, in my opinion, a very strong daughter-in-law to stand a mother-in-law and say, no, I'm not going to listen to what you're saying to me, i.e. return to my own home, but I'm going to stay with you. You know, that relationship about in-laws, and especially mother-in-laws, is interesting, especially as we don't know much from their perspective. We hear it through the narrative of the obligations for Boaz in regards to the Judaic law and responsibilities.
Yes, that's right. And it's sort of part of the conversation we were having earlier about Orpah, doesn't it, really? You know, that whether it's to do with their own safety, whether it's to do with loyalty, whether it's to do with, you know, where is the best place for them in the time. Joe, you want to share with us, and don't forget to take yourself off mute as you do so.
I went, yeah, and then realised. I just wondered, really, we talk a lot when we're sort of thinking about the Bible as to what God's plans were, and God isn't really mentioned in Ruth, and I just wondered what people thought about whether this was all part of God's, I was going to say God's cunning plan, showing my age there, as to, you know, that was what was planned all along, because eventually, of course, Ruth's son was, you know, in Jesus's family tree, so to speak. Mm-hmm. I just read again the bit about naming the child, and it's actually quite interesting. As Caesar said, it was the women that named the child. It says, the women blessed Naomi, blessed be the Lord, so he is mentioned, who's not left you without next kin. Your daughter-in-law loves you. Then Naomi, we talked about this in our group as to whether Naomi was a wet nurse, so to speak. Mm. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. And the women then gave him a name. Mm. And it was just a sort of combination of those two things, really, as to where God is in all this, as to whether the actual story is a story to explain how God worked in his people to produce the heir of to produce Jesse and therefore then David, and then the other way around, and then eventually Jesus.
Well, this is something that Michael alluded to at the start of our conversation today and last week as well, isn't it? That God seems to be working through the lives of people, but in a very veiled way within this context. And, you know, some people might argue that the story is there to enable us to see what that genealogy looks like and to show us how it works through the lives of ordinary people to get to that place. So, you know, I suppose there's a lot of argument about where God is in this story, because God is obviously very present in the story, and Naomi very in particular feels that she's either been abandoned firstly and not abandoned latterly. You know, the arc of this story really revolves around Naomi in that sense, really, how she felt apart and then how she felt back. You know, back into where she felt she ought. Ian and Carol, I know there was a hand waving at your end. I don't know if you wanted to point or something different.
Well, he was talking about where God is story, but we were talking earlier when we were reading it, and Ruth says it's a kind of reading of, I think it's in Isaiah or Jeremiah. God says, "I will be your God and you will be my people," and she's saying a kind of wording of that is, "Your God will be my God and your people will be my people."
Okay.
So it's really a story of people following God or going towards God rather than away from God. It's almost like the family went away from God going to Moab, but the family going back towards God. Just a thought.
Okay, so we're seeing some kind of familiar patterns to what we're reading in the Old Testament around people's relationship with God through this story, what they expected to happen and what within the space. Just that we've only minutes left. I'm thinking about, so what are we noticing for today from this story? The question I asked myself was, what am I still seeing happening in church and society that reflects this story? What am I noticing that's happening around me today as a 21st century Christian that I see reflected in the story of Ruth, either that I like or that I don't like? And particularly, seeing as we're looking at it through a feminist lens today around women. So if I was to offer the first thing that I've written down here, well, I would say women are still often in many cases seen as citizens because approaches to life and just being a woman, actually sometimes you're just not regarded because it's a woman's viewpoint. And I'm not saying that's universally true. What I'm saying is that I notice it still, and I notice it still within church life. So I wonder what you're noticing in the 21st century. What's happening in our society that picks up on some of these themes from Ruth, whether they're positive or whether they're difficult. And we'll just take this as a group conversation. So electronic hands to the ready, if you wouldn't mind, in this particular case. Kim, do you want to start us off, please?
I always seem to, and yeah, I mentioned in my small group that I've read Ruth again today using my Common English Bible, and noticing what words it changes from the narrative I'm used to hearing in my head, and it's very clear where Boaz gives that warning or that reassurance to Ruth in the field, that the warning he's given to the young men is not to assault her. Okay. And it's very clear that it's this thing about, you know, the men felt they had to assault her. And that really makes me angry, because I see that, you know, we talk about victim blaming, you know, women are still charged with, you know, what they're wearing, what they say, how they behave, as if it's they do something wrong, and there's a permissive giving in society that people could be treated like that, and it's our fault. And that really gets my going. So, okay. But I was really surprised that they used that word. You know, it's a very brave word to choose in this text.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a really valid point. Nivette.
Yeah, what I see in this story is very much this story of migration, and the way that people have always travelled to try and find a life, to make a life somewhere. First of all, there's no bread in the house of bread, so they go to Moab and to make a life, and they do make a life. And in one sense, Naomi goes out full, but comes back empty, and then becomes full again at the end. And that's what I see with the stories talking about the baby being handed to Naomi, that, you know, God doesn't leave her throughout the whole story. She goes through that cycle of being full and then empty and then full again at the end. Yeah.
And I think those stories of migration will come up again, obviously, in the last of this cycle of considerations around Ruth. But you're right, actually, that people currently within our society today are on the move. They're finding themselves in very difficult circumstances. They're seeking out how to make a life, and how people receive them and how people protect them or nurture them or treat them is very much part of the game as to the way we're seeing things in our current culture. Anybody else want to share? Oh, Michael, you want to unmute yourself? Say something.
I don't have a digital hand, so
that's very
use a physical one. Without making a judgment or kind of ethical call either way, I think one of the things that does strike me in this text is this story of Ruth discovering her sexuality as one of her most effective tools of agency. And I think there are ways that can be celebrated by some and derided by others, but it's certainly something which I have seen a lot of, and particularly my kind of history as a youth worker, see a lot of in terms of girls discovering that their primary agency can be established through their own sexuality. And there being both some positive aspects to that and some negative aspects to that, and the way that society seems to have accepted and formed around that as a construct, rightly or wrongly.
Yeah, and I think I would echo that, and I would say that in this story, Ruth is actively encouraged by Naomi to go there, as I say, to get a bath, to put a perfume on, to put a glad rags on, and to go and do what she needs to do to get access to what she needs to. And actually the understanding how that works, that women have in some contexts have only got that route to get what they need is quite a tough thing to hear. And in the 21st century, we know the stories of human trafficking, we know the stories that women have to church and society. But, you know, it's something we're seeing in the story of Ruth, and it's something that we're noticing today as being really critical. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've got loads more of layers of things, but one of the things I want to finish with before we pray together is to think about the intersectionality within this story. That actually it's not just a story about women and men, it's a story about women and men, and then what it is to be, you know, from another culture, and what it is to be a Moabite, and what it is to be, and actually the intersectionality and all the layers within it. It's not enough to look at it from this one angle. So I'm really keen to think of this text through a feminist lens, but I'm equally as keen that as we look at Ruth, or in fact any Bible story that we come to look at, or any text that we come to consider, that we look at it through lots of lenses, and we really look at it through many, many different viewpoints, so that as we ask God to help us as preachers and leaders of worship, or people talking about the Bible to others, that we pay attention to what is being revealed to us in a moment through those layers. We can't just see it one way. That intersectionality that happens on all sorts of levels, around race, around gender, around context, around culture, all come to play together in one space. Goodness, I think we could probably talk forever and ever at this, and we will be really careful to think about what's been put in the chat room, and to get that to you so that you can have some conversations around it. If it's okay with you, I'm going to end our time together with prayer. Me and Michael will be around. If anybody wants to stay and natter for a couple of minutes, we'll still be here. We're not going far. All right, but let's pray together as we close our time. Loving God, we know from this story of Ruth that women are a very important part of your story. Help us to look carefully at what's revealed. Help us to see what you would have us see, and not what we've simply dreamt up. Help us to notice the stories of women today, and to speak out in solidarity and protection, or to raise the profile of women. Help us to notice the stories of men today, especially those who are advocates for women, and those who speak out so that others might see their example. We're thankful for this story, for the men and women within it, and for the fact that it's got so many layers, which will reveal to us the rich tapestry of Scripture, and help us to see more of your story in our world every day. Amen.